Some killers leave marks on history not just through their crimes, but through the chilling way they preyed on society's innocence. Today, we uncover the dark story of Tsutomu Miyazaki, a man whose obsession, manipulation, and terror shook Japan in the 1980s. This is a longer journey into one of the most infamous cases in Japanese criminal history. Tsutomu Miyazaki was born on August 21, 1962, in Itsukaichi, a quiet town in the western part of Tokyo. From the very beginning, his life was marked by challenges that shaped his future in profound ways. Miyazaki suffered from a rare congenital deformity that affected his hands. His wrists were fused to his forearms, which limited his ability to move them normally. In a society where physical conformity was highly valued, this condition set him apart from other children and made him a target for bullies. At school, he faced ridicule from classmates and struggled to fit in. While he was intelligent and academically capable, excelling in literature and reading, the constant teasing led him to withdraw. Teachers described him as quiet and introverted, someone who rarely socialized and preferred to spend time on his own. This isolation slowly deepened, becoming a defining part of his early life. At home, Miyazaki's family situation provided little comfort. His father, a successful newspaper publisher, was largely absent due to work. His mother offered little warmth, leaving Tsutomu with a sense of neglect. The one exception was his grandfather, who became the most important figure in his life. Miyazaki admired him deeply and felt that he was the only person who truly understood and cared for him. This bond gave him some stability, but it also meant that when his grandfather later passed away, the loss would hit him especially hard. Even before this loss, Miyazaki was developing unusual habits. He became fascinated with manga, anime, and films at a very young age. While many children in Japan enjoyed these forms of entertainment, Miyazaki's interest went far beyond the ordinary. He collected thousands of tapes and often spent hours locked away in his room, living in a world of cartoons, horror movies, and fantasy. Over time, this heavy reliance on escapism blurred the lines between reality and imagination. As he grew older, the sense of alienation only increased. His physical condition made him extremely self-conscious, particularly around girls, and he struggled to form meaningful friendships. By his teenage years, he was almost entirely withdrawn, spending more time with his collections and fantasies than with people. Those who knew him described him as socially awkward, emotionally distant, and incapable of forming close connections. There were also early signs of concerning tendencies. Miyazaki developed an unusual fixation on children and innocence, something that would later have tragic consequences. Combined with his loneliness, lack of emotional support, and obsession with dark forms of entertainment, this created a fragile psychological foundation. When his grandfather passed away, Miyazaki's fragile world collapsed further. He was unable to process grief in a healthy way and instead sank deeper into isolation. This marked a turning point in his life, reinforcing his detachment from reality and further weakening the boundaries between imagination and acceptable behavior. By the end of his teenage years, Tsutomu Miyazaki had already developed the traits of someone heading down a dangerous path. His physical challenges, emotional neglect, obsessive escapism, and psychological struggles created a combination that would later erupt into one of Japan's most infamous crime cases. Though still unknown to the public, the early seeds of the figure who would later be called the Otaku Killer had already been planted. By the time Tsutomu Miyazaki entered early adulthood, the difficulties that had marked his childhood and teenage years had hardened into permanent traits. His inability to form relationships, his dependence on fantasy worlds, and his obsessive habits combined to create a life that was detached from ordinary society. While many of his peers pursued careers, relationships, and independence, Miyazaki's world shrank further into isolation. After high school, he enrolled in a local junior college with the hope of becoming a teacher. This path, however, did not last. Although he initially showed promise, his lack of motivation and his social awkwardness made it difficult for him to succeed. He eventually abandoned the idea of teaching and took a job at his father's printing business. The work was unfulfilling, and he struggled to adapt to the routine of adult life. This sense of stagnation only reinforced his withdrawal into fantasy. As Miyazaki's responsibilities in real life dwindled, his collection of videotapes continued to grow. What began as a hobby became an all-consuming obsession. He was particularly drawn to horror and exploitation films, and his room became a kind of archive filled with thousands of tapes. Spending countless hours watching, rewatching, and cataloging, he immersed himself in a controlled environment where he felt safe and powerful. Unlike the outside world, where he faced rejection and indifference, his world of tapes gave him structure and purpose. Psychologists often describe this stage of his life as one where isolation and fantasy created a dangerous cycle. The less Miyazaki engaged with real people, the more he turned to media, and the more he relied on media, the less he was capable of interacting with others. Over time, this cycle narrowed his worldview and dulled his ability to empathize. The fictional horrors he consumed daily began to influence his thoughts, normalizing ideas that most people would find shocking or disturbing. At the same time, his fascination with youth and innocence grew more pronounced. Friends and acquaintances later recalled that Miyazaki often seemed uncomfortable around people his own age, but strangely fixated on children. This fixation did not emerge suddenly. Rather, it developed gradually alongside his detachment from adult relationships. In many ways, it reflected his own arrested development, an inability to mature socially and emotionally, which left him stuck in a state of perpetual adolescence. The death of his grandfather remained a defining trauma. Miyazaki never fully processed the loss, and his grief expressed itself in unusual ways. Instead of finding closure, he clung to the memory of the only person who had ever given him affection. The absence left him emotionally adrift, and his coping strategies, retreating into fantasy and collecting tapes, only widened the gap between him and reality. By the mid-1980s, Miyazaki's life was defined almost entirely by isolation, fantasy, and repetitive habits. He no longer maintained close friendships or clear ambitions for the future. His position at the family's printing business gave him little satisfaction, and nearly all of his free time was spent alone in his room, surrounded by his growing collection of videotapes. To those who knew him casually, it may not have been obvious, but the intensity of his obsessions was steadily increasing. His reliance on tapes, his inability to connect socially, and his detachment from everyday life were combining into something deeply concerning. During this period, Miyazaki began showing signs that his inner world was starting to spill over into reality. His discomfort in dealing with adults, combined with years of social withdrawal, made him increasingly unable to form normal relationships. The fantasies that once stayed confined to the screen and his imagination began to shape the way he behaved in the outside world. For someone who had lived so long in isolation, the line between imagination and reality was beginning to blur. By the late 1980s, the conditions for tragedy were firmly in place. Tsutomu Miyazaki had become a man unable to cope with the pressures of reality, detached from empathy, and consumed by compulsions that no longer remained private. What had begun as escapism in his teenage years was transforming into a dangerous obsession that would soon have devastating consequences. By the late 1980s, Tsutomu Miyazaki's inner world had crossed a dangerous threshold. What had once been confined to tapes and fantasy began to manifest in real life. Between 1988 and 1989, a series of disappearances shocked Japan. Over the course of just over a year, 4 young girls vanished, and later investigations revealed that Miyazaki was behind them. The first case occurred in August 1988, when Mari Kano, a 4-year-old girl, disappeared while playing near her home in Saitama Prefecture. Her family's desperate search drew local attention, but in the early days, there were no concrete leads. Just 2 months later, in October, 7-year-old Masami Yoshizawa went missing on her way home from a friend's house. The similarities between the 2 cases unsettled investigators, though at first they struggled to connect them definitively. In December of the same year, tragedy struck again when Erika Namba, another 4-year-old, disappeared after leaving a friend's home. By now, the public was deeply alarmed. Newspapers covered the cases extensively, parents became fearful, and communities were gripped by unease. The final case occurred in June 1989, when 5-year-old Ayako Nomoto vanished. With 4 disappearances in less than a year, investigators began to suspect a single individual was responsible. The connection between the cases became clearer when anonymous phone calls and letters were received by the victims' families, cruelly taunting them. These disturbing communications, later traced back to Miyazaki, revealed a chilling attempt to exert control even after the crimes had taken place. For the police, the investigation was unprecedented. Detectives interviewed hundreds of people, patrolled neighborhoods, and checked local records, but the perpetrator remained unidentified for months. The lack of progress only fueled public anxiety. Television and newspapers reported every development, portraying the unknown criminal as a figure that terrified communities across Japan. When Miyazaki was finally apprehended, what shocked the nation further was the discovery inside his home. Investigators uncovered a massive collection of videotapes, thousands stacked from floor to ceiling. While many contained television programs, cartoons, and horror films, others pointed to far darker interests. This discovery reinforced the label the media quickly adopted, the Otaku Killer. The coverage surrounding the case ignited a national debate. Commentators questioned the influence of anime, horror, and pop culture, while others focused on Miyazaki's upbringing and long-term isolation. For Japanese society, the crimes became a reflection not only of one individual's actions, but also of broader anxieties about cultural change and alienation in the modern age. For the families of Mari, Masami, Erika, and Ayako, the pain was immeasurable. Their loss was compounded by the unwanted attention of a media storm that often sensationalized the tragedy. For Japan as a whole, the case destroyed a sense of safety that many had long taken for granted. By the time Miyazaki was identified as the suspect, the damage had already been done. 4 families had lost their daughters, and the entire nation had been shaken. The crimes marked a turning point in Japanese criminal history, exposing the dangers of unchecked isolation, obsession, and hidden psychological struggles. The arrest of Tsutomu Miyazaki in July 1989 marked the beginning of one of Japan's most closely followed trials. From the very start, the central question was not whether he had committed the crimes, the evidence was overwhelming, but whether he was mentally competent to be held fully responsible. The courtroom became the stage for a debate that divided experts and the public alike. Multiple psychiatric evaluations were ordered. Some specialists argued that Miyazaki suffered from serious mental illness, pointing to his inability to connect with reality and his detached behavior. Others concluded that while he displayed disturbing traits, he was fully aware of his actions and deliberately chose to carry them out. This conflict became the heart of the legal battle. Was he insane, or was he simply evil? Throughout the hearings, Miyazaki's behavior left a deep impression. He appeared unemotional, at times cold, and showed little sign of remorse. His lack of reaction when the names of the victims were read aloud outraged the public and further reinforced the view that he was beyond redemption. For the families of Mari Kono, Masami Yoshizawa, Erika Namba, and Ayako Nomoto, the trial was a painful process, a constant reminder of their loss played out under the full gaze of the media. In 1997, nearly 8 years after his arrest, the Tokyo District Court delivered its verdict. Tsutomu Miyazaki was guilty on all counts and sentenced to death. The defense immediately filed appeals, but each was rejected. The Supreme Court upheld the sentence in 2006, confirming that Miyazaki was legally sane and accountable. 2 years later, in June 2008, he was executed by hanging. His death closed a legal chapter, but the broader impact of his crimes remained. The legacy of the case extended far beyond the courtroom. In Japanese society, it became a turning point in how crime, mental health, and media influence were discussed. The sensational coverage of Miyazaki's hobbies created long-lasting stigma around the word otaku, painting it in a negative light for years. Manga and anime fans often found themselves unfairly associated with his crimes, sparking debates about how much responsibility culture should bear for individual actions. For criminologists and psychologists, the Miyazaki case became a study in the dangers of isolation and untreated psychological issues. It highlighted how alienation, grief, and obsessive behavior can spiral into tragedy when left unchecked. Universities, journalists, and policymakers have since cited the case as an example of why mental health support and early intervention are critical. For the victims' families, however, the legacy is more personal and painful. No verdict or sentence could restore what they had lost. Mari, Masami, Erika, and Ayako remain remembered as innocent children whose lives were cut short, and their memory continues to stand at the center of the tragedy. Today, Tsutomu Miyazaki is remembered as one of Japan's most infamous criminals. His case continues to provoke discussion, not only about his actions, but about the society in which he lived. It serves as both a warning and a lesson, a reminder that the deepest dangers often grow unnoticed, hidden in isolation, until it is too late. The story of Tsutomu Miyazaki is one of the darkest chapters in Japan's modern history. It reminds us how isolation, untreated psychological struggles, and obsession can lead to devastating consequences. While justice was eventually served, the loss endured by the families of Mari, Masami, Erika, and Ayako can never truly be measured. If you found this video insightful, consider subscribing to the channel for more true crime documentaries. Your support helps us continue exploring the cases that shaped history and ensures that the stories of victims are never forgotten.